On the 3rd of October 2074, an Aztlan fighter squadron met a great dragon over the Pacific Ocean. The pilots had trained for this engagement for more than 2 years. Their aircraft came from secret research programs. Their weapons had been designed for one body in the world. Even so, the first wave lasted seconds. Sirrurg turned into the formation before its targeting systems could settle. He broke aircraft with his claws, burned others with magic, and scattered the survivors into a disordered fight west of Acapulco. A second wave came behind them, command aircraft surrounded by expendable drones, all carrying versions of the same classified weapon. Some of those drones were expected to be destroyed. Their loss was part of the delivery system. Then the missiles began to connect. More aircraft arrived from another base. A naval group closed from the coast. The sky filled with drones, spirits, gunfire, and military machines built for an enemy that could think, cast spells, and change direction faster than a fighter. Aztlan had spent much of the war losing ground so that this force could remain hidden. For the first time that day, something struck Sirrurg deeply enough to draw blood. That was the sign everyone had been waiting for. It was also the point at which the plan became a battle the planners could no longer control. This is the account of the Destroyer, the great dragon who helped found Amazonia, declared an entire nation guilty, and forced that nation to invent a weapon for dragon blood. It is also the account of what happened after Aztlan brought him down and discovered that victory did not give it the right to keep him. The sixth world moves fast, and it forgets faster. Some things must not be forgotten. This is one of them. The record must step back 40 years to the 28th of August, 2034. Brazil was already weakened by the upheavals of the new century when a force of awakened beings and metahumans seized Manaus. 3 great dragons led them. One was Hualpa, the feathered serpent who would become the public face of the new order. Another was Sirrurg, a great western dragon whose methods were already less selective. The third has never been conclusively identified. The advance moved outward from the Amazon basin. Brasilia fell in November, Brazil surrendered, and Hualpa proclaimed the nation of Amazonia. This was more than a change of government. The rainforest had awakened with the return of magic. Spirits and paranormal creatures now acted as political and military powers, and the new state was built around the claim that the land itself had standing. Industry, settlement, and extraction would be judged by what they did to the living system around them. Sirrurg gave that claim its coercive force. Contemporary accounts attribute the destruction of military units, industrial districts, and entire neighborhoods to him during the takeover. The numbers are uncertain, and many of the surviving accounts are openly hostile, but the pattern is consistent. Hualpa could negotiate for Amazonia. Sirrurg demonstrated what refusal might cost. They should not be mistaken for partners with a shared philosophy. Hualpa governed a nation containing cities, trade, diplomats, and millions of metahumans. Sirrurg withdrew into the interior among awakened creatures and showed little interest in compromise. Their interests overlapped wherever industrial power threatened Amazonia. Their views of the people living inside that struggle were very different. On the 23rd of September, 2041, that difference acquired a public symbol. EuroAir Flight 329 encountered Sirrurg in European airspace. The flight recorder preserved the crew's attempt to descend, the loss of 2 engines to magic, a breach in the aircraft, and the sounds of a final struggle. One passenger appears to have resisted with magic. It did not save the aircraft. Sirrurg's motive remains disputed. One account suggests that a particular passenger may have been the target. Other sources treat the whole flight as an act of indiscriminate terror. The uncertainty matters because it would follow him for decades. He often seemed to choose a specific enemy, then accepted the deaths of everyone nearby as part of reaching it. After Flight 329, the public name attached to him became difficult to separate from the event. He was the destroyer. After the airliner, Sirrurg largely disappeared from public view. Absence in the Sixth World rarely means inactivity, especially where a great dragon is concerned. Later profiles described intermediaries, spirits, awakened creatures, and an underground network used against corporate and government targets. Those reports were assembled from rumor and hostile investigation, so they establish a reputation more securely than an organization chart. The clearest thread is environmental absolutism. Sirrurg was associated with attacks on polluting industries and with movements willing to kill in defense of land that could now answer back through magic. Primera Vaga and Green War became recurring names in reports around him. Membership, sponsorship, and shared purpose were often blurred together. It is safest to say that extremists regarded Sirrurg as a patron or model, and that some of them later fought beside him. This helps explain how Sirrurg and Walpa could seem estranged while serving the same strategic direction. Walpa needed an Amazonia that could endure in a world of states and corporations. Sirrurg treated much of that world as the underlying offense. Diplomacy could preserve the rainforest for a season. He was prepared to remove the people and institutions threatening it. In June 2064, Aztlan executed a feathered serpent named Zitbalchin after accusing him of involvement in a bombing at a peace ceremony. The execution was broadcast. Aztlan scientists then dissected the body, recorded the autopsy, and retained the remains. The legal case was closed by metahuman institutions. Among dragons, it remained an injury to a species with very few members and a long memory. The autopsy also produced data. Aztlan learned how draconic organs, tissues, and blood responded after death. For years, this looked like a secondary indignity in a larger dispute. By 2074, the information would become part of a weapons program. The state that had taken one dragon apart would use what it learned to make another one bleed. The next stage began as a conflict between Aztlan and Amazonia, not as a war between metahumans and dragons. The two states had contested Colombia, trade routes, ideology, and the future of the rainforest for years. In early 2072, after Amazonian agents were caught inside an Aztlan research facility, Aztlan declared war. Each side claimed the other had engineered the incident. The armies moved before the argument could be settled. Aztlan fought through a close partnership between the state and Az technology. The uniform on a soldier and the logo on a supply contract did not always identify who had given the order or paid the bill. Its forces used armor, aircraft, blood magic, surveillance satellites, and conventional chains of command. Amazonia relied on dispersed cells, local knowledge, spirits, and magic strengthened by the rainforest. One side was easier to coordinate, the other was harder to find. Aztlan's opening offensive was devastating. Amazonian cells lost the natural spirits they expected to support them. Blood spirits drove fighters into lethal terrain, and armored forces advanced behind the disruption. Thousands were captured. The war then settled around Bogotá, where armies, insurgents, mercenaries, corporations, and local factions fought across a city that neither nation fully controlled. Sirrurg changed the calculation because he combined roles that modern militaries distribute across many systems. He could gather intelligence through spirits and agents, cross hundreds of kilometers without an airbase, attack as a flying siege engine, and use magic whose limits Aztlan could not measure. Concentrating troops created an efficient army against Amazonian cells. It also created a single target for a dragon. His war had more than one cause. He was aligned with Amazonia against an old enemy. He regarded Aztlan and technology as destroyers of the natural world. A great dragon who knew him would later say that Zitbalchen's execution and autopsy had become a central source of his present rage. Sirrurg himself extended responsibility further. In his reasoning, citizens who tolerated the state shared the state's guilt. That principle removed the boundary between a military campaign and collective punishment. On the 18th of January, 2073, Sirrurg applied it to a city near the contested frontier. Cali was an Aztlan military center close to the contested frontier. It was also a city of homes, businesses, hospitals, and people whose connection to the war might be no more than the place printed on an identity record. Sirrurg arrived with other dragons, wyverns, drakes, spirits, extremists, and hired fighters. The attack on the base lasted roughly 3 hours. Aztlan troops fired enormous quantities of ammunition into airborne targets. Tanks and mortars joined the defense. Some of that fire struck the city. Within the base, Sirrurg's coalition tore through soldiers, buildings, and equipment. Recordings describe troops attempting to surrender and being killed. By the time reinforcements arrived, War estimated that Aztlan had lost as many as 5,000 military personnel. Sirrurg then used magic against the surrounding city. At 12:58 in the afternoon, cameras recorded a brilliant blue flash across part of the business district. People inside the affected area collapsed, while buildings and plants remained standing. Later medical accounts claimed that victims died through conditions their own bodies might eventually have developed: heart failure, aneurysms, cancers, respiratory disease, and genetic disorders accelerated into the same instant. Those details come from an in-world magical interpretation, and the exact mechanism was never established in a form ordinary medicine could verify. The consequence is less uncertain. War placed the civilian dead close to 10,000. Stormfront used the more conservative description of thousands. The attack killed on a scale that no conventional defense in the city could interrupt. Cali changed Aztlan's operational doctrine. Large formations were broken into smaller units because another concentration could invite another strike. Amazonia already knew how to fight through dispersed cells and exploited the adjustment. Aztlan became less able to mass force at the places where a conventional army should have been strongest. The strategic effect extended beyond the battlefield. Every base now had to consider whether it was a military asset or bait. Every city had to consider whether its industries, taxes, and compliance made it a target under Sirrurg's definition of guilt. Aztlan could still win battles against Amazonian troops. It could not promise that victory in one place would prevent a city from dying somewhere else. A difficult military problem had become an engineering requirement. Aztlan needed to locate a target that could disappear, force him to a place chosen in advance, interfere with his magic, and damage a body built to survive weapons designed for aircraft and armored vehicles. It also needed to do this before the fear of Sirrurg hollowed out the rest of its war effort. Cali also created a legal question. The United Nations treated Sirrurg's actions as crimes against metahumanity and called for a war crimes tribunal. Declaring jurisdiction was the easy part. No police service could deliver the accused, no prison had been demonstrated capable of holding him, and any attempt to kill him risked turning other dragons against the state that succeeded. Hestaby brought the dispute into the open. In 2073, she addressed the United Nations and condemned Sirrurg's attacks, breaking a draconic custom against exposing internal conflicts to metahuman institutions. She offered intelligence about a possible future target, promised her help if Sirrurg were captured alive, and proposed that a great dragon sit beside metahuman judges at a future trial. Her speech was an accusation and a warning. She described Zitbalchan's execution, public autopsy, and retained remains as a continuing outrage among dragons. She argued that Sirrurg had turned that grievance, environmental destruction, and older injuries into a campaign with no civilian limit. She also warned that reprisals against uninvolved drakes and dragon eggs were making Sirrurg more attractive to dragons who already regarded metahuman law as a threat. Aztlan rejected the central bargain. Its government promised lethal force at the next encounter and announced that Sirrurg's remains, if recovered, would become Aztlan property. That response showed why Hestaby's proposal could satisfy neither side. Aztlan regarded capture as an unreasonable restriction on national defense. Many dragons regarded any metahuman tribunal as a precedent that could someday be used against them. Hestaby's intervention nevertheless changed the conflict. A great dragon had publicly supported judgment of another by a metahuman institution. Sirrurg's guilt was now tied to a larger argument about sovereignty, whether dragons living among modern nations were subject to their laws, and whether those nations could claim authority over a species that remembered civilizations older than the courts judging it. The phrase "Great Dragon Civil War" can suggest two armies meeting on a single field. The reality was a network of feuds, reprisals, thefts, proxy attacks, and arguments about what dragonkind should become in the Sixth World. Metahuman agents carried much of the violence. Corporations, hordes, drakes, younger dragons, and entire cities became leverage. Hestaby represented the most public case for accommodation. She argued that dragons and metahumans had built institutions together, and that those relationships would collapse if mass killing went unanswered. Her opponents saw the United Nations speech as a betrayal of draconic authority. Even dragons who disliked Sirrurg could reject the idea that metahuman judges should decide his fate. Lofwyr occupied a different position. He was the chief executive of Seder Krupp, as well as one of the most influential great dragons. His power depended on a world in which dragons could guide metahuman systems without destroying them. Hestaby's public challenge weakened draconic custom. Sirrurg's campaign encouraged anti-dragon weapons, and open supremacism threatened the corporate order from which Lofwyr drew much of his reach. His brother, Alame, made the supremacist case directly. Alame gathered younger dragons at GeMiTo, the devastated region around Genoa, Milan, and Turin. Reports accused his followers of treating the sprawl as a feeding ground and of making hundreds of people disappear each day. The exact totals were impossible to verify, but the pattern was sufficiently visible that corporations appealed to Lofwyr for intervention. Sirrurg was not simply an officer in Alame's faction. His war against Aztlan had its own history, allies, and objectives. Yet Cali strengthened every dragon who argued that metahuman lives carried little weight, while the response to Cali strengthened every metahuman program intended to kill dragons. Separate fronts were feeding the same escalation. By 2074, the conflict had acquired the structure of a civil war, even without a unified command on either side. Hestaby's assets were attacked. Lofwyr and Alame mobilized followers. Draconic secrets became military research. Sirrurg continued striking cities. Each action narrowed the space in which restraint could still be interpreted as strength. Sirrurg's next decisive target was Borinquen, the island once called Puerto Rico. The island held NatVat processing facilities that produced roughly 80% of Aztechnology's food products. That figure did not mean the facility grew 4/5 of everything eaten in Aztlan. It meant that one industrial complex sat inside a vast chain of processed food, distribution, retail, and corporate provisioning. On the 18th of August, Hurricane Donald reached the island. Sirrurg and his followers moved with the storm, using conditions that kept conventional aircraft away and gave air and water spirits enormous force. For almost 8 hours, they crossed from one part of Boringen to another, destroying NatVat sites and other infrastructure. Relief forces arrived to find production capacity that might never return. The choice of target turned logistics into a weapon. Destroying a tank removes one tank. Destroying a plant at the center of a food network removes products from warehouses, shops, military contracts, and household cupboards far from the original attack. The immediate damage belonged to Borinquen. The shortages and price movements traveled through corporate markets. A second disaster followed the hurricane. Black rain fell on Aztlan's eastern coast, and a blight destroyed corn across a widening area. Sources disputed whether the cause was Sirrurg, corrupted astral conditions, Amazonian action, or something carried through the storm. It should be kept separate from the documented assault on NatVat. Together, however, the lost processing capacity and failed crop helped create a wider food crisis. As technology used the attack as evidence that it stood between ordinary consumers and a dragon prepared to destroy their food. The corporation had been part of the state conducting the war and part of the research effort aimed at dragon kind. It could now present itself more simply as the injured provider. Sympathy weakened Aztlan's isolation and prepared the public story for the operation already being assembled against Sirrurg. The inversion was politically valuable. Sirrurg intended to make Aztechnology pay. The scale of his attack allowed Aztechnology to recast the conflict around the vulnerability of its customers. A corporation associated with blood magic and conquest was moving toward a new title, Dragon Slayer. Behind that public story was Project Blue 227. The program drew on information gathered from Zitbalchan's autopsy and on research conducted under medical cover. By early 2074, Aztechnology's chief executive informed President Enrico Silva that the project had become viable. For the first time, Operation Marauder possessed something its planners believed could change the physical terms of an engagement. Blue 227 was a biochemical weapon aimed at proteins in draconic blood. Depending on its mixture and the oxygen present, it could promote coagulation or prevent it. In plain language, it was designed to make a wound refuse to close, or to make blood clot where it should continue flowing. A dragon's armor, magic, and scale mattered less once the process was operating inside the body. The program appears to have included a magical component, though the surviving accounts give no reliable explanation. They also provide no confirmed delivery manual. Jackpoint analysts inferred specialized munitions and drones designed to release the compound when Sirrurg destroyed them. Later histories state that drones exposed him before conventional forces moved in. The exact balance between inhalation, fragmentation, and direct impact remains uncertain. Blue 227 did not make a great dragon easy to kill. It created a temporary condition in which accumulated damage might begin to matter. Aztlan still needed enough aircraft to survive the approach, enough attacks to place the compound, enough firepower to exploit the effect, and enough magical force to prevent Sirrurg from ending the battle on different terms. Other states were already pursuing anti-dragon drones, aircraft, chemicals, and magical systems. Cali had shifted such research from an exotic contingency into a matter politicians could describe as public safety. Each program was also useful against ordinary targets. Money appropriated to stop a dragon could purchase aircraft, surveillance, and weapons for the next conventional war. This was the larger threshold crossed by Blue 227. Metahuman institutions had begun converting the anatomy of dragons into an engineering discipline. Whatever happened to Sirrurg, the knowledge would remain in laboratories, procurement systems, and military planning. President Silva made Operation Marauder the highest priority of the Aztlan military. Advisors urged him to return resources to the failing southern front. He refused. Units around Bogotá were stretched, supply lines suffered, and territory was surrendered while pilots, magicians, aircraft, satellites, and special forces were held for a single target. Aztlan first had to find him. Teams hunting around Roswell suffered extreme casualties whenever they met Sirrurg or his followers. In time, they located a secondary stronghold about 15 kilometers outside the city. It was a smaller horde rather than his principal lair, protected by wards, spirits, drakes, dracoforms, and adult dragons. The original plan had been to catch Sirrurg at the site. He left before the assault could begin, reportedly summoned to a meeting by Walpa. Aztlan chose the alternate plan. At 1350 Zulu on the 3rd of October, Ground Task Force 1 breached the stronghold, fought through its defenders, removed its casualties, and planted mining charges. The raid served two purposes. It tested Blue 227 against adult dragons inside the complex, according to the strong implication of the later briefing. It also attacked something a great dragon regarded as an extension of memory, status, and self. The force withdrew and detonated the charges. Part of Sirrurg's horde vanished underground. There was no guarantee he would answer quickly or personally. Sirrurg understood traps, and the resources hidden across Aztlan would become harder to conceal with every day of delay. Approximately 2 hours later, observation satellites acquired him moving at high speed along the western coast before turning over the Pacific. 3 air task forces had been arranged around the expected route. Task Force 2 launched first from Guadalajara. Task Force 3 followed in support. Task Force 1 remained in reserve, while ground elements and Sirrurg's followers raced toward the same battlefield. The carrier Huey Tlatoani and its group moved in from the Pacific. Aztlan had found its moment. It had not found a safe way through it. Task Force 2 intercepted Sirrurg roughly 40 kilometers west of Acapulco. The first fighters attempted a coordinated attack and were broken apart almost immediately. The second wave used drones and airborne command systems to attack through the disorder. Several hits were recorded. Task Force 3 arrived with experimental Bloodwing aircraft and added new vectors to the assault. Sirrurg adapted. He sent spirits against regrouping aircraft, destroyed drones at close range, and turned toward land in search of a better position. Naval vessels followed with missiles and gunfire. Near the coast, the destroyer Chupacabra struck his left shoulder close to the wing joint with a railgun round. The impact drew blood and brought him down roughly 30 miles north of Acapulco. Landing did not end the fight. Heavy-lift aircraft placed mobile artillery around the area. Naval guns continued from offshore. Air controllers stacked waves of surviving craft at different altitudes, sending a fresh group whenever Sirrurg tried to break out. On his 5th attempt to regain the sky, observers reported torn wings, severe bleeding, and the loss of his right eye. The task forces were being destroyed with him. More than half the drones and nearly half the aircraft in the 2 engaged formations were lost or forced away. Pilots ejected over the Pacific. Command aircraft fell to spirits. When the on-scene commander requested withdrawal, the order from above was to continue to the last person. After roughly 98 minutes on land, Ground Task Force 1 and Sirrurg's reinforcements arrived from the north and met before reaching the main battle. Followers of the Dragon destroyed temporary fire bases and pushed naval elements away. Local troops, militia, private aircraft, and people carrying old weapons joined without coordination because they understood who was on the ground nearby. The resulting airspace ceased to resemble a planned operation. Dragons, dracoforms, spirits, modern fighters, obsolete aircraft, drones, and ground fire moved through the same volume. A blue mist spread through the engagement zone as weapons and magic accumulated. Aircraft collided or were struck by their own side. The chemical weapon had helped make Sirrurg vulnerable, but the force exploiting that vulnerability was consuming itself. Sirrurg remained alive, mobile, and capable of magic. Aztlan had achieved the condition imagined by Marauder's designers, a great dragon grounded and bleeding inside a ring of weapons. The problem was that the ring was breaking faster than he was. Sirrurg ordered his surviving followers away and called spirits to carry him into the clouds. The remaining task forces tried to pursue, but many aircraft were damaged or out of ammunition. Several kilometers above the battlefield, he began the same class of entropy working associated with Cali. Reports describe his body glowing blue, followed by a discharge about half a kilometer across. The shock wave then collapsed back toward its center and killed those inside the radius. Later jackpoint analysis suggested that an Aztlan ritual had reflected Sirrurg's own power. Claims involving the Sextant of Worlds, a magical locus, and mass sacrifice remain informed but unverified accounts of how that interference was achieved. The spirits carrying Sirrurg were destroyed. He fell, struck the ground, and did not move. Aztlan troops outside the blast began to close on the site. If they reached him, the government's stated policy left little doubt about the intended result: lethal force, recovery of the remains, and further research under Aztlan control. A storm formed before they arrived. Winds made the area inaccessible to aircraft, and witnesses reported at least 2 enormous figures moving through the obscured field. When the weather cleared, Sirrurg was gone. The ground held wreckage, bodies, and a burned indentation where he had fallen. The sources do not identify the figures or establish which dragons removed him. Aztlan had defeated Sirrurg in battle. Blue 227 worked, the task forces held long enough, and the threat that had paralyzed its army disappeared from the front. Yet the state did not possess the prisoner, the body, or the weapon's most valuable proof. Someone had intervened between military victory and execution. Less than 2 hours after the battle, Aztlan launched Operation Huntress around Bogota. Forces hidden during the long preparation for Marauder now entered the Southern War. Sirrurg's defeat became the opening move in Aztlan's wider recovery, even as the question of his survival passed into the hands of the dragons who had taken him. The Civil War's other major front reached its conclusion 1 month later, in GeMiTo. By then, Alame and his followers had used the ruined northern Italian sprawl for about a year. Reports of disappearances, public feeding, and attacks on local communities had made his doctrine of dragon superiority a material condition for the people living there. On the 5th of November, Lofwyr moved his coalition into the region. Younger dragons and metahuman forces fought across damaged settlements and fortified positions. Mercenaries and Shadowrunners served on both sides, sometimes with little understanding of the larger objective. The sources count 38 dragons besides Alame among the dead, and describe severe losses among the metahuman units. The battle continued into the morning of the 6th. Lofwyr and Alame eventually met in the air, where their fight became direct and physical. Alame was already under pressure from the wider collapse of his position. He was wounded, grounded, and attacked by metahuman fighters before he died. Lofwyr survived, despite serious injuries, and a separate magical strike whose authorship remained disputed. The outcome mattered beyond the death of one dragon. Alame had made open predation the clearest expression of the supremacist position. His defeat removed the faction's most visible champion and demonstrated that Lofwyr could assemble both dragons and metahumans against it. That did not make the winning coalition humane. It made Lofwyr's version of order dominant. GeMiTo paid for the distinction. A damaged urban region had become a feeding ground, a staging area, and a battlefield for powers whose dispute concerned the governance of their own species. Residents disappeared before the final battle, soldiers died during it, and the surviving city inherited the wreckage after the dragons turned to their next question. With Alame dead and Sirrurg removed from Aztlan, the open military phase could close. Dragonkind now had to decide what those victories meant, which breaches of tradition would be punished, and whether metahuman institutions would have any place in the judgment. 3 days after GeMiTo, a formal assembly of great dragons was called. Its location was concealed. From the 8th of November through the 8th of January, great dragons disappeared from their lairs, companies, territories, and public routines. Agents continued their work, but the figures who normally directed them were absent. Sirrurg attended. He was still recovering from the battle outside Acapulco, which confirms what Aztlan had been unable to prove at the site. The storm had carried away a living prisoner. Ghostwalker attended, as did Hestaby, Ronabwi, Masaru, Hualpa, Lofweir, the Sea Dragon, and the other great powers willing or compelled to answer the summons. The absence created openings. Neonet pressed against Satyr-Krupp markets while Lofweir was away. Criminal organizations attacked rivals protected by Lung and Ryumyo. Hundreds reportedly died in the resulting clashes across the Pacific region. A gathering intended to restore draconic order temporarily weakened the systems through which dragons maintained order elsewhere. Sirrurg's case came first. Some at the assembly sympathized with his grievances and wanted his wounds treated without punishment. Hestaby, Ronabwi, and Masaru argued that he should be transferred to metahumanity for a war crimes trial. Hestaby continued to support a joint tribunal in which dragons would also participate. The proposal failed. The majority chose to keep jurisdiction within Dragonkind. The United Nations had declared Sirrurg a criminal. Aztlan had built the force that captured him, and thousands of metahumans had died. None of those facts gave a metahuman institution a seat in the room where his future was being decided. Lofweir then argued for punishment on grounds the Assembly was more willing to recognize. Sirrurg's campaign had endangered dragon interests around the world. It had encouraged attacks on drakes and eggs, accelerated anti-dragon weapons programs, exposed internal divisions, and made other dragons targets for reprisals. The problem presented to the Assembly was therefore the damage Sirrurg had done to dragonkind. Even that case required political effort. Reports from draconic networks say Lofweir spent significant influence to assemble a majority. He acknowledged that some of Sirrurg's grievances had merit, while arguing that they should have been pursued through subtle pressure instead of violence that provoked threats against the species. The agreed sentence was imprisonment. No reliable source gives its precise length. One contact described it as the equivalent of generations for metahumans, a phrase broad enough to mean decades or centuries. The location was withheld, and the method was left to speculation: a sealed cavern, separation of body and astral form, or confinement on a metaplane accessible only through the combined power of several great dragons. The Assembly also protected Sirrurg's hordes. Guards and spirits were placed around his lairs so that outsiders could not take them while he was confined. The assets of a convicted metahuman war criminal might be seized, sold, or used to compensate victims. Sirrurg's property remained under the protection of the court that sentenced him. The asymmetry requires little embellishment. Cali, Borinquen, and the other attacked cities carried their dead and their losses into the future. Aztlan bore the cost of the operation that made imprisonment possible. Dragonkind kept the prisoner, the place, the mechanism, the duration, and the property beyond outside review. Sirrurg was punished because a majority of great dragons accepted that he had endangered them. Whether the people he killed received justice was a question the Assembly did not allow their institutions to answer. The end of the campaign did not restore what it had removed. NatVats lost capacity, and the crop failures continued through food markets and distribution systems. Prices rose, corporations repositioned supply, and households far from Borinquen experienced the consequences as shortages rather than as a dragon attack. As technology emerged with a new public asset, it had helped build Blue 227, supported the task forces, and participated in the state machinery that brought down the destroyer. The same corporation that Sirrurg intended to punish could now market its products and security through the claim that it had protected metahuman civilization from him. Military planners elsewhere studied the result. Aztlan had shown that a great dragon could be tracked, baited through an attack on a horde, exposed to a tailored biochemical agent, and contained by overlapping waves of conventional and magical force. States have copied far more expensive methods after seeing them work once. Blue 227 therefore outlived its target. The underlying data, research personnel, delivery questions, and battlefield observations became part of an international anti-dragon industry. Aircraft justified as dragon defenses could patrol borders. Drones built to overwhelm a great dragon could overwhelm ordinary air defenses. A weapon born from species fear entered the general inventory of power. The Civil War left other landscapes behind. GeMiTo was ruined. Mount Shasta's community and Hesteby's network were broken in the settlement that followed. Saderkrupp and Neonet absorbed attacks while their draconic patrons fought. Younger dragons, mercenaries, agents, and civilians disappeared into casualty lists assembled by institutions that never saw the full war. Open fighting among the great dragons subsided, but its central disputes remained. Dragons still operated through corporations and states while claiming forms of sovereignty beyond them. Metahuman governments still lived with creatures they could sometimes deter, but could not reliably arrest. Both sides possessed stronger reasons to prepare for the next confrontation. Somewhere outside the reach of every metahuman court, Sirrurg remained alive. The location of his prison is absent from the record. Its nature is equally uncertain. His body may lie in a cavern. His spirit may have been separated from it, or both may have been carried to a plane that ordinary travelers cannot enter. The uncertainty is part of the sentence. A visible prison can be inspected, guarded, challenged, or attacked. Sirrurg's confinement depends on the secrecy and continued agreement of the dragons who imposed it. If that agreement changes, no metahuman authority possesses a gate to keep closed. Aztlan proved that a modern state could bring down a great dragon. The proof required years of anatomical research, the sacrifice of territory and troops, a biochemical weapon, 3 task forces, naval support, hidden magic, and a willingness to continue after the battle plan collapsed. Even then, the state could not keep the body. Dragonkind proved something different. It could remove one of its own from a metahuman battlefield, reject a metahuman trial, and impose a punishment no outsider could measure. Sirrurg lost his freedom. The dragons retained jurisdiction. Nations change more quickly than great dragons do. Governments fall, corporations merge, military secrets spread, and a sentence measured in generations continues somewhere beyond the map. The unresolved question is not whether Sirrurg survived. It is who will decide that his punishment is complete. Until the next chronicle, go carefully in the 6th world.